thank you. I'm appreciative of all of you coming out on a cold day like this to hear this story. Can you hear me? No. Okay. That's unusual. I'll move up. And my sister-in-law's here, and she is an editor, and happened to mention to me that, what should I say over here?
No, let's just move
Oh, that's
it. It's very sensitive.
okay.
Is that okay?
I guess so. All right. She pointed out to me that I put 2025. I'm just in the habit. I haven't got out of it, but it should be 26. Sorry. Okay. The story that I'm going to tell you today is an interesting one. It has a local connection, but it also goes way, way back, and I think you'll find it a very fascinating story. This is, no, I'm sorry, back up, my fault. This is actually today Deerfield, Massachusetts, as it looks today, but I'm guessing the geography hasn't changed very much. And so if you can just visualize a little village tucked down in there beside the Connecticut River, and that would be Deerfield of the time that we're going to start talking about. Imagine that it's leap year, February 29th, 1704. A western Massachusetts village lay buried in the snow, and behind a stockade, the approximately 255 residents are asleep in their homes, including the watchman. Near dawn, a noise is heard. The watchman stirs, fires a shot, and yells arms. But few hear, and what happens next is a tragedy. But before we get to that part of the story, let me tell you about one of the families living in the village on that fateful night. Godfrey Nims was born in England on October 22nd, 1648. He emigrated to the American colonies between 1600 and 1665. He was just a teenager. Nobody really knows why he came or how he got here, but arrive he did. On screen, what you're seeing is a copy of the church registry of Godfrey's birth in London. I know you can't read it very good. I took a magnifying glass and looked up close, and sure enough, there's his name and date, and it's in London, England. I know there was some misconception at one time that the Nimses came from France, Nimes, France, in fact, and they have not proved that yet. Although they're thinking if you could somehow go back before where they have so far, perhaps it does go back to France. The first official record of Godfrey Nims appears in America on September 24, 1667, in a Springfield, Massachusetts court. He, James Bennett, and Benoni Stebbins, all young lads of Northampton, Massachusetts, planned to run away to the French in Canada. They went into a house while the family was at church, and they took 24 shillings in silver and 7 in wampum. Their plan was to run away to the French in Canada, and they were going to pay a local native guide to take them north. Needless to say, they were caught. They were sentenced to be well whipped on their naked bodies. Nims and Bennett with 15 lashes and Stebbins with 11. Punishment was quick and harsh in the Puritan colonies. No other evidence of wrongdoing was found concerning Godfrey, thank goodness, but his friend Benoni Stebbins was prosecuted and fined for wearing his hair too long in 1676. And he must have married an equally rebellious young woman, because in 1678, his wife Mary was fined 10 shillings for wearing silk contrary to the law. And then aggravating this offense, she did it again. The scandal, I imagine. Benoni and Godfrey, their lives continued to be intertwined. There was, as you know, considerable fighting between the colonists and Native Americans. Native peoples burned houses and killed livestock in an effort to reclaim land taken from them by the English. On March 4th, 1676, Northampton, where Godfrey had lived, it was attacked, and the newly built palisade was breached. Godfrey and his old friend Benoni probably had been involved in the building of that very palisade. Both men had their houses burned in an earlier attack in 1675 at Pocumtuck, which was the earlier name of Deerfield. And both Godfrey and Benoni were volunteers led by Captain William Turner at the Falls Fight on May 19th of 1676. This occurred during King Philip's War, when colonial militia retaliated against earlier assaults by natives on the settlements. This attack by the colonists was heralded as a turning point in the war, leading to eventual colonial victory and expulsion of most Native Americans from the Connecticut River Valley. Unfortunately, it was also a brutal massacre of hundreds of non-combatants, mostly women, children, and elderly Native Americans trying to flee. So it's not a particularly proud moment. Okay. Thank you. In 1662, both Godfrey and Benoni, along with their wives, were living in Deerfield and were among the first town elders. I guess they changed their characters. By trade, Godfrey was a cordwainer, that is, he was a shoemaker, as well as a farmer. He owned considerable property and held public offices, including as a constable, a tax collector, and a member of the school committee. Godfrey was considered an honored and respected citizen. Godfrey married Mary Miller Williams, the widow of Zebediah Williams, who had been killed by natives. He and Mary had 6 children, and after Mary died, Godfrey married Mehitabel, the widow of Jeremiah Hull. Together, Godfrey and Mehitabel had 5 children. He also cared for 4 stepchildren, 2 from each wife. Now that's quite a family. 4 months before the night in question, Godfrey's son John and his stepson Zebediah were captured by Indians while they were in the meadow attending to their cattle. And they were marched off into what is now Canada. On February 29th, the night I first mentioned, 1704, Godfrey's home was occupied then by 12 people. Himself, his wife Mehitabel, 4 young daughters, Mehitabel, Mary, Mercy, and Abigail, 2 sons, Ebenezer and Henry, stepdaughter Elizabeth, plus daughter Rebecca, her husband, and child. His daughter Thankful and husband Benjamin lived in their own cave home nearby. Now that was the cave home that Godfrey had first built for himself when they came there. His stepdaughter Mary and her husband and 2 children also lived in the village. I want to give you a little political background though first. Despite the First Nation claims to the land, settlers like those in Deerfield kept pushing westward in their quest for more land for their expanding families to farm. As such, they were a threat to the dwindling indigenous population and to the smaller French colony in Canada. Deerfield, you can see, is on the very western edge of colonized land in the 1670s, and as such, it kind of became a flashpoint in the ongoing conflict for dominance in the New World between the French and the English, each supported by their indigenous allies. I know you've all studied in elementary school and junior high about the French and Indian Wars. There were multiple of them and they lasted for a long time. Okay, in the summer of 1704, the French governor of Montreal, you can see Montreal way up there, was secretly planning a new thrust over the ice toward the little village. French-led attack forces, largely made up of the Abenaki, the Mohawk, the Pennacook warriors, started southward over the Green Mountains. They had snowshoes, sleds to carry supplies, and dogs to pull the sleds. They left the sleds and dogs in the woods for their return trip. They covered the rest of the 20-mile distance by foot as quickly and quietly as possible. Surprise was their most potent weapon. I had to draw this map, so I wanted you to be able to see clearly without the modern maps with all the towns and everything in there. But they basically came down on the east side of Lake Champlain and then into the tributaries across into the mountains and down to the Connecticut River, which is the big one that forms the border between Vermont and New Hampshire, and then continues on down into Massachusetts, where Deerfield lay. Across the river to the west of Deerfield, the attackers made final preparations. They put on their war paint, loaded weapons, and reviewed plans. Several had been to the village before as traders, so they were familiar with the layout of the village. About 4 a.m., the village was silent. The attackers moved in. The snow had piled up high on the north end, and the drifts made walkways right to the top of the fence. 40 men dropped down, then opened the gate to admit the rest. The watchman, who had been asleep, heard them, called arms, but it was too late. The attackers began breaking through doors and windows. Some villagers escaped and fled to neighboring villages. Some tried to hide, but they had little success. Now this quote was from a book, which is over there, that was printed in 1707 by the minister of the town of Deerfield. So that's how he described it. This was the attackers' chief prize, Minister John Williams, veritable leader of Deerfield. They broke into his home. The raiders crushed the skulls of his 6-year-old son John, and 6-week-old Jerusha. Plus they murdered a family slave. He had several slaves. William, his wife, and other 3 children were taken captive. And they were among 112 people, half of them children, who were marched up 300 miles into Canada. Only about half of them ever returned to New England. They mentioned daughter Eunice, is that up there? Mm-hmm. Yes, daughter Eunice. I wanted to make sure I remembered to talk about her because I didn't really research her particularly. But she didn't come back because she didn't want to come back. She stayed with the native people that she was being raised by. So, his other children, his other 2 sons, did return with him eventually. And this was the way that book looked then. Okay, in total, there were 47 Deerfield residents who were killed during the attack. I've seen a few different numbers, but they're all right around 47 to 50. As for Godfrey and his family, you can see where his home is, and you can see there at the north where the Indians came over the fence and came in. You can also see his friend Benoni, his house is there, and the pastor's house is there as well, right here. According to this key, the dark brown ones were all burnt. The houses were burnt. So Godfrey's house was burnt. 3 of his young daughters smothered in the basement. His son Henry was killed by a tomahawk, and so was his infant grandson Mattoon. His wife Mahitable and 3-year-old daughter Abigail were abducted. Meanwhile, Mahitable, age 36, the wife, died in the march. What I read was that the natives, they wanted to take as many as they could back to Canada. But if you couldn't keep up, or if you were sick, or if you were too little or too old, and you weren't keeping up, they killed you. And I think that was seen as a merciful act, because to be left behind in the woods alone, starving, and possibly attacked by animals wasn't a better fate. So his wife, Godfrey's wife, Mahitable, dies age 36 on the march. Abigail was taken to a fort near Montreal. She's the 3-year-old. Stepdaughter Mary and her husband Philip were killed on the march. His son Ebenezer and stepdaughter Elizabeth were all taken captive and into Canada. Both were later redeemed from them. All of Godfrey's family, except daughter Thankful, were dead or in captivity in Canada by March of 1704. Thankful and husband Benjamin escaped the Indians by remaining hidden in that cave home. Godfrey's estate, valued at £250 and comprising a house, a barn, and contents, were all burned. And Godfrey died within the year, and I'm guessing of a broken heart. All of this is a sad piece of history, but there's one very good reason that I've chosen to share it with you. You do remember that I mentioned a son and stepson who were taken captive while they were caring for the cattle in the meadow? Well, stepson Zebediah died in captivity near Quebec City. But here's the good news. There had been serious efforts after this massacre at Deerfield to redeem or go back and rescue the Deerfield captives. That started in late 1704. There had been some exchange of prisoners of war between the French and the English, but it was complicated. The French and the native raiding parties usually captured men, women, children, basically civilians. The English took mostly soldiers, privateers, warriors, war leaders. So the English didn't have a very large incentive to exchange captured soldiers for civilians, while fighting continued between the French and the English. So their attempts were kind of futile a lot of times. But there was a little bit of a difference between the Deerfield captives and others, and it was the importance of that Puritan minister, Reverend John Williams. His prominence, and also because there were so many captives from Deerfield, over 100, remember, that were taken, and that caused the Massachusetts government to make a more sustained effort to try to return them. Plus, Williams had clerical colleagues like Increase Mather and Cotton Mather. Do you remember those names? I remember those names from school. Old Puritan ministers, you don't? Okay. I do. Thank you. Because I guess the name stuck with me, you know. They were important men, and then with the help from the governor and from merchants, and of course residents of Deerfield who were living, they pressured for the redemption of those captives. They sent letters, they sent emissaries up into Canada, and men volunteered to undertake rescue missions. Well, let's just say it was a slow going. That would be a crushing disappointment to the Deerfield captives, as the English emissaries failed to obtain their release. Well, 4 men decided to take matters into their own hands, and on May 10th of 1705, which happened to be the feast of the Holy Sacrament, and so a big procession day, lots of parades and celebration. Joseph Petty, these are all Deerfield men. Joseph Petty was 32, Thomas Baker, 22, Martin Kellogg, 18, and John Nims, 26. They had, it said, and I quote this, liberty to go in and about the city of Montreal, 2 words, and there they happened to meet together. I don't understand the circumstances of their imprisonment exactly, but evidently they were allowed some freedom of movement. They were housed with French Canadians, these men were, and they were likely required to work for their enslaver, but they had freedom to walk about. My guess is that nobody expected anybody to try to run away home 300 miles away across the mountains and lakes and rivers and unfriendly natives. Anyway, at this meeting, Nims and Petty informed the other 2 of their plan to escape. And somehow they obtained guns and provisions, and they met before dawn on May 14th, a Monday. They must have had a canoe because they paddled across the St. Lawrence River there. And 2 days later, they reached the Richelieu River. That's the one from Lake Champlain up to the St. Lawrence. Let's see. The Richelieu River, where they where they exited was near south of Fort Chambly, and I'm not certain where that was. But they crossed over and continued walking then for a week. They came upon Lake Champlain and luckily found 2 abandoned canoes. Good luck. Some good luck there. And taking one of them, they paddled up the lake. They were forced by strong winds eventually to abandon the canoe, and then they traveled by foot to the Winooski River. That's right there, Winooski River. And they followed it till they crossed the Green Mountains and reached the White River. By now, of course, their provisions had run out, and they had had to spend some time hunting and fishing, and it said they survived mostly on fish and reptiles. I'm hoping turtle. At the confluence of the White and Connecticut River, they built a raft and floated down the river. So now they're on Easy Street, going right down the river to Deerfield. They arrived weak and faint, as Petty described. All 4 men reached Deerfield on June 8th, and it had taken them 26 days. This Petty wrote a document, a letter, describing their trip, and that's the only reason we would know this. Okay, so John returns to Deerfield only to find that his father's gone, their home's in ruins, and most of his family's dead or in captivity. And what about stepsister Elizabeth Hull, who was taken on the march to Canada? In 1706, she was redeemed from captivity. The natives took prisoners for several reasons. One, especially the children they hoped to adopt into their family, is to replace lost members. Some they took for slaves, and some they took to ransom for money. Elizabeth was ransomed. They also took, occasionally took a captive for this explicit purpose of killing them or torturing them in retribution. And there was one attempt on the march of someone, one of the warriors selecting a man that he wanted to burn. He said he wanted to burn him, and because of a loss in his family. And another native, for some reason, who had more seniority evidently, stepped in and said, "I'm claiming him," and he didn't. And he survived. So, harrowing experience. So along with fellow escapees Baker and Kellogg, John joined missions to Canada to try to redeem more captives because they had some knowledge of this trail. You'll recall that his brother Ebenezer and sister Abigail, the little 3-year-old at that time, had been taken to Canada, and they were still there. So when he was in Quebec, John met his 12-year-old, by this time, half-sister Abigail, but could not convince her to return to Deerfield. She'd been raised, I mean, she was 3. She'd been raised by a French-Canadian Catholic family, and that's where she wanted to remain. She eventually married a fellow Deerfield captive named Josiah Rising, and they made their life in Canada. And when I was doing research, they got their whole genealogy on there too, from the Nimses. So. It wasn't until 1714 that the brother Ebenezer and his wife Sarah Hoyt, also a Deerfield captive, returned to Massachusetts. They'd been held by Huron masters in Lorette. So, returning to Deerfield, John and Elizabeth had 8 children, among them Daniel. Daniel and his wife Charity had 10 children, and among them a son also named Daniel. That's the Daniel that served in the Revolutionary War that we talked about earlier. He married Lydia. Of course, that's not really Daniel there. I had to get a picture, sorry. He married Lydia, and they left Massachusetts for Bolton, New York. And they had 9 children, among them Amasa. The local connection, getting to that. Sorry, I turned that around. Amasa was even more adventurous than his father. He and his brother Elio joined a party of travelers bound for the West, crossed the Mississippi on the ice and arrived February 23rd of 1839, right here in Maquoketa. Among the travelers was a young woman named Phoebe Adeline Goodnow, who was planning to become her older brother John's housekeeper. Yes, it's that John that we all know is the founder of Maquoketa. However, love must have intervened, and she and Amasa were married a month after their arrival in Maquoketa. I don't know any more about that story. Sorry. Theirs was the first wedding in Maquoketa, and their child, John Wesley Nims, was the firstborn in the community. Amasa and Adeline had 7 children. Among them was Creon, who with his brother Owen became a boat builder. They operated excursion boats on the Maquoketa River, including the Forest Queen and the Jessie. On the banks of the river south of the Bridgeport Bridge, they had a park called the Shoot the Chutes. Now I think the Nims property included land where, you know where Craig Winiger lives today? Any of you? On the Codfish Hollow Road? Okay. On that land and the land on the other side of the road, no, frankly, up and down the Codfish Hollow Road, all Nims family. And it's in that general area where the Shoot the Chutes was, which would have been above the Klondike Dam, right? Okay. I know there was another Shoot the Chutes above Lakehurst. Okay, but this was on the south side. Creon and his wife Harriet had 7 children, among them a daughter, Alice. Alice married M.F. McKinsey, a newspaper editor, the Excelsior, and they had 2 children, Dorothy and Fay, known as Bud. Daughter Dorothy, a longtime newspaper reporter and editor, married Robert Myatt. They had 2 children. So to tie the lesson together and wrap it up, you're looking at Dorothy and Robert's daughter, Barbara. Godfrey's great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter. So, thank you for listening to this important history lesson. I'm apologizing to my Nims relatives here. This covered the last 300 plus years and a small important part of my heritage plus a piece of early Maquoketa. As we know, lots of others in this room can trace their lineage to Godfrey Nims through other children of Amasa and Adeline. I found these pictures of John Wesley when he's older, Owen Weed, James Knott, and Addie Nims Ellithorpe, who all have descendants living in this area. I was going to write down all these names I found in Bertha Nims' book. I quit. There's just so many people that have a connection to the Nims family in this area. It's just amazing. So if you ever want to, I know Bonnie has that book. There's one in the library too. Probably half of you do. I do. These were my resources. I had to go to a lot of the, like Iowa State and Luther and different colleges that had books on the Deerfield Massacre. You can find all kinds of information on it. It was really a significant event at the time, or in history. I like this one. The Deerfield Massacre is at our library right now, and it's the only one that was available now. And it was printed last year, but the one by the Reverend is really hard to read. Of course, it was written in 1707, and it's also mostly a sermon. He was a Puritan minister, and he's preaching through the whole thing as he tells about his encounters. And to be quite frank with you, he was more fearful of his soul being lost if he was converted to Roman Catholicism than he was of being killed by the Indians. So that was a big thing, and it was just, they were bad. So his book is fascinating to look at, but it's a little hard to digest. The Captives, Captors and Captives, was a really interesting book, and I kept turning up things about the Nimses as I went along, so that's a fun thing. I also brought along my own picture that was painted of the Forest Queen, and it was done a number of years ago, I guess, from a photograph. And I also brought my personal history that I keep of the genealogy of the Nimses, following mostly from my side, which of course is what this has been. So I'd like to just know by show of hands, how many of you had a Nims connection in here? Rosie, don't you have a Nims connection?
Pardon me?
Don't you have a Nims connection?
Yes, I do. Oh, I'm sorry.
I thought so. All right. Okay, any questions that I, yes?
Just a thought as you've gone through this, talking about that raid on Deerfield and the savagery involved in that, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, those people lived in such a horrible time. And then October 7th, massacre in Jerusalem. I thought, you know, as a species, we haven't developed a whole lot. We just in the U.S. are so insulated from that. We don't appreciate how good we have it from that.
That's a really good point, yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Now, when the Canadians, the Indians, came down to do that massacre, was it all Indians, or was it a mix?
It was French.
It was French white people?
Yes, French
Oh,
people.
okay.
French, this is French and Indian War.
Okay.
And the French were, they had their allies among the Indians. The English had their allies among the Indians. But this was a French-led party organized by the governor of Montreal.
Oh, thank you. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Bud McKinsey was my neighbor when we moved to the place on 231 McKinsey Drive. And he had, my husband and he were in business together, and somehow Dave complained about me collecting old stuff. And he was cleaning out his shed, and he told me he had the bell that was on the riverboat that goes up and down the river on the weekends. So it's on a pole at what is now my grandson's house. I was going to take it down and bring it, but he said, how am I supposed to get my kids in from the woods? His child is a month old, so it'll be a few years. But he knows where it's supposed to come.
Did you paint that picture?
No.
Oh.
This was done probably back, my mother had a painting done of the Forest Queen by Glee Porter.
Oh, wow.
Glee Porter was the newspaper lady. She was also an artist, and she painted one, and it disappeared. Well, the years when she was ill, and I don't know just what happened to it. But you know, she had about 5 years before she died, and one thing she really regretted was losing that. And so I knew a lady in Miles who painted it. Julie Keel. She painted it. She was Julie. Yeah. She married a Yoka. You guys should. Okay. She painted it, and I gave it to Mom for Christmas, and she died the next year. So that's why I keep it. I'm done.